You're listening to the Turn Autism Around podcast, episode number 217. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Barbera, and today I interviewed Jillian Benfield, who is the mom to three, including the mom of Anderson, who's 8 years old and has Down syndrome. But the episode's not really about Down syndrome. It's about Jillian's new book, The Gift of the Unexpected, and we talk all about grief, expectations, hope, how our lives are transformed by being parents of disabled children. It's a really great episode, and I hope you love it as much as I did. Thanks so much for joining us, Jillian. I'm really looking forward to this interview.
Thank you. I was really excited when you asked about it.
Yeah, so I saw you on Facebook. I saw that you had a new book coming out. And at the time when people are going to hear this, the book has been out for a month or so. So I got the privilege of reading the first two chapters last night. I am super excited to help you get the word out about the book because I think it's so important. So this episode is going to be about like expectations and the gift of the unexpected, and that's the title of your book. But before we get into all of that, tell us about your fall into the world of special needs.
Sure. So I'll start in 2013. I was a news anchor and reporter in Augusta, Georgia, and in Columbia, South Carolina. And my husband was in dental school at that time. And when he graduated, the military footed his dental tuition bill and they moved us across the country for a 1-year residency in Las Vegas, Nevada. So we had just had our first child. It was the perfect year for me to take off. And then I thought I would go back to TV news. And then I got the phone call that our next assignment, where we would spend the next 4 years of our life, was Alamogordo, New Mexico. So I don't know if your audience is familiar with Alamogordo, New Mexico, but there's not even a Target in Alamogordo, let alone a TV news station. So I was pretty devastated that day. I mean, I cried incoherent tears that day, just wondering, where was my life heading now? And that same day, I got this nudge to take a pregnancy test, and it was positive. And we were not trying. We were not in the business of trying. We had a newly turned 1-year-old. And I just thought, okay, I guess I'm supposed to be a stay-at-home mom. Well, fast forward 3 months, we arrive in Alamogordo, and I almost immediately have my 20-week ultrasound. And I noticed that the ultrasound was taking a long time. And the tech finally got her measurements and she thanked us. She flipped on the lights, walked out, and a nurse walked in and she goes, well, everything must be great because the doctor's not here. And as soon as she said those words, he walked in. And he explained to us that there were several markers on the ultrasound that indicated that our child had a higher chance of having a trisomy. And me, having no medical background, said, well, what does that mean? And he said, it means your child has a higher chance of having a condition like Down syndrome. And I just remember my back breaking out in fire and the words, I can't be a special needs mom. I can't be a special needs mom. I can't be a special needs mom, just repeating over and over again in my head. Well, then we got blood work done. And I got a phone call from my husband about 9 days later that the doctor had called him and told him that it wasn't good news and that we needed to come in. And we did. And his speech went something like this. It was, well, it's not good news. Your child has a 99.9% chance of having Down syndrome. And it's normally at times like these, people want to talk about their options. It's like, what options? And he said, option 1 is you terminate the pregnancy. We don't do that here, but we can get you to a place that does, but you need to make the decision quickly. And I said, what's option 2? And he said, option 2 is you continue your pregnancy with a high-risk doctor. And my immediate question, which I think would be most parents' question, is, well, can you tell us about Down syndrome? Like, what does this actually mean? Like, what does it mean for his life? And he seemed very surprised by the question. And he kind of did this thing with his eyes like this and waved his hand. And he said, well, at worst, he'll never be able to feed himself. And at best, he'll mop the floors of a fast food restaurant one day.
Oh,
but don't worry. Yeah. And it got worse. So, but don't worry. You don't have to be a hero. You can have the baby here and we can keep him comfortable, but we don't have to do anything drastic to save his life. So in other words, we could have the baby to keep our consciences clean, but we could let him die of natural causes. The doctor believed that our child would not have a life worth living. And I believe that is in part why I grieved as if a death had taken place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. And, I know there's a lot of people listening that have children with autism, either they had issues along the way, a higher percentage of preemies, for instance, go on to have an autism diagnosis, whether there were delays from the start, or whether, like my son, regressed and, was typically developing and then, started to regress and it was confusing and a struggle to get the diagnosis. And, I literally felt the same way when we got Lucas's diagnosis the day before he was 3. And then at the 3rd birthday party, which was already planned, the next day, I felt like we were grieving. Like it was almost like not a birthday. It was like a funeral because we were grieving that, expectations out the window. Even on the drive home from the hospital after Lucas's diagnosis, my husband was saying things like, he'll never get married, he'll never go to college. And I'm married to a physician too, so I can relate to all that. And I'm also a nurse. And I told him to stop, like his brother never went to college. We don't know what Spencer's going to do. He's only 18 months old at the time. Like, who are we to have all these thoughts of a perfect life with a white picket fence? And so like at that moment, that's why reading your book last night, the first 2 chapters was like, yeah, this makes so much sense that we live our lives, we have our careers, and we expect, you had one child and everything went well and they're progressing on, you're not expecting something like this to come in and be so disruptive. And then kind of tear apart your whole expectations of life.
Right. Well, I think for most of your listeners listening, we're products of the American dream, right? If you work hard enough, you can have the life that you want. And I think that when you have something like this happen, and there's nothing that you did to cause it or can do to prevent it, it kind of rocks your core because like you're a nurse, your husband's a physician, I was a journalist, my husband is a doctor, and we had done all the right things, right? But we don't have that kind of control. And we know that in the back of our minds. But because that American dream mentality is so strong for all of us, it just shakes you to your core.
Right. So your son was born, he has Down syndrome, and he also, very common with Down syndrome, he also has some heart issues. Did he need surgery right away or?
He did. So at 5.5 months, we had to get him to 10 pounds, and he got to 10 pounds at 5 months old, and he had open heart surgery.
Mm-hmm. And how old is he now?
He's 8.
He's 8. And you have 3 children. So
I do.
What are their ages?
I have a 9-year-old girl. I have Anderson, who's my son with Down syndrome, who just turned 8, and a 5-year-old boy.
Okay. All right. So, so that obviously changed your world, changed your life, changed your family. So what about, your life did you decide to write a book? And like, what's the book about? And how might my listeners, like, I highly recommend the book. I pre-ordered it. I read the first 2 chapters. It really does. It's not about Down syndrome. It
No.
is about, what is it about?
So the book is about really how the unexpected things that happen to us in our lives can ultimately help us become who we're supposed to be. That doesn't mean that the unexpected things that happen to us in our lives happen on purpose. There are some things that are unexpected that are just too painful, and that I would never tell anyone that, well, this happened so that this could happen. But the things that happen to us, including having a child with a disability, are able to show us who we really are while pointing us to who we are really supposed to become. So the book, a lot is in part about that grief. And then I had to dissect, why am I grieving so much? Why did I grieve so much? And at the end of the day, I realized that I believed at the time when I had my child, and for years after, probably, that my worth was attached to my resume. So if I believe my worth is attached to my accomplishments and my attachments, right? Like your husband went right to the, he'll never get married, he'll never go to college, right? Absolutely. That's where our minds went to, because that's what we value as a society. There was a Gallup poll that I quote in the book, where when we ask people what we view as success, marriage is at the top of that list, followed by education, right? But those same people who were questioned wanted to break away from that, right? They wanted to break away from this version of success and have their own unique versions of success. And my point in saying that is, the unexpected can help us unlearn the bad ideas we have received from society, that our worth is attached to our output, when really our worth is intrinsic. And so that's the crux of the book. It's about how we can unlearn the bad ideas that we have been given by society, by our churches, that tell us that we have to earn our worth in this Americanized way, when really our worth is something that has already been given to us. And when we are living in that place, then we can really become the fullest versions of ourselves.
Yeah, I like that. We did do another episode with a mom who had a son with Down syndrome and autism. We can link that in the show notes. I did an episode with my husband too, which we can link in the show notes. And another thing I liked about your book related to kind of my husband and our grief, was you said in the first chapter or 2 that your good memories are fuzzy. And I always say that. I'm like, I have a bad memory for things, like, were we ever at a Jimmy Buffett concert? Yeah, we were. We were there 3 times. We had a party at our house. I'm like, really? Oh, I don't remember. But you said for things that are problems, for bad things, quote unquote, bad things, the details are so there. So like when I interviewed my husband, it's like, and maybe it's because I tell the story, I write about our story all the time. So like, it's a part of my, more normal talking about it, but I remember the details. I remember where we were standing, the carpet color of our old house, like the details of when you get quote unquote bad news, it was something I had never read before. So
yeah, I just remember that feeling so distinctly, like you enter a tunnel, and everything in that tunnel becomes so crystal clear around you. And it's kind of like you're having an out of body experience, I guess. And I do talk about that in the book, because I think anyone who has been delivered any kind of really hard news, can relate to that. I think that's a very common human experience.
Yeah, you say tunnel, like I kind of use the analogy, like I felt like I had fallen into a deep hole with Lucas and had to figure out how to get myself out of it with him on my back, like it was a lot. And it was a lot of, where do you start? What is it? What are the outcomes? What could we, and with autism, the range is so much probably more than Down syndrome even. You have people with autism that I've interviewed that are fully conversational, going to college, driving, getting married. And
I think
go ahead.
I was going to say with that hole, and you trying to dig yourself out of it, that piece of the going through the logistics is not necessarily the hardest piece, even though it's super hard, right? Like to do the research, to find the things that you need to find to help your child, to call this person, to deal with this insurance agency. And you can go through those motions, which is difficult. And it's what I always say is that being a parent of a kid with a disability is more. I've had people say, well, you could say this about all parenting. I'm like, yes, and also no, because it's more. There is a layer to my life that you cannot understand, but you can deal with that more in your mind. The hardest part is dealing with that under layer when it comes to yourself, and really observing your grief and sitting with it long enough and allowing it to teach you. And so that you can eventually move forward, not only move forward though, but move forward changed.
Yeah. And I think another reason why grief is hard to talk about in the autism world is because there's a subset, a minority of very vocal people who have very high levels of autism or self-diagnosed autism, who believe autism is a gift and you should just be, you should never have gift. Like the analogy of the funeral, like I could get backlash for that, for saying that.
Sure.
And it's like, do you have that in your life? Like, are people expecting you to be like just happy and accepting? And
sure. So I try to be careful about what I say about Anderson in the hard parts of our lives, but and I do believe that Down syndrome is intrinsically tied to his identity. I believe that he would not be who he is without Down syndrome. And I believe my son is who he should be. But what I will say is the word that I typically use when discussing the hard parts of our lives is the word and. Like I used to be a but user. So it would be like, going to all these medical appointments is really hard, but it's so worth it. I would minimize the hard parts of my life. But now what I do, or what I try to do, is just hold it in both hands, right? So disappointment and joy can coexist. Stress, extreme stress that can come with parenting a child with a disability, and gratitude can also coexist. So I try to live my life not in a but world, not where I minimize the hard parts. And there are hard parts. There are hard parts. I told you before we started, the things that I thought would be the hardest, the idea that maybe he would always live with us. And I don't know if he will, but maybe he will. I don't know. That part's not hard for me anymore, or as much as it was. The hard parts for us are really behavior related and relate to that ADHD component and things that I think your listener can relate to. Those exist. The hard parts exist. And also, I can honestly tell you, I am grateful that my child is who he is. And I'm grateful that I get to parent him. And I am not the same. I would not be the person I am today without him. And both of those things are true. And so that's where I try to live while trying to respect my child's privacy. I'm sure I've failed. I'm sure, I have gotten backlash from similar advocates before, and I try to learn from that. And try to live in this and world.
Yeah, that's nice. You do talk also in your book about ableism, and you know, it's kind of I would say a newer term, to me anyway, like in the past, say 5 or 7 years, the term ableism, or you're an ableist, or and I don't know how, I don't think we've ever talked about the word ableism. Can you define it and tell us what you mean by you thought you were an ableist?
So I wish I had the definition in front of me. I use it in the book. It's from activist Leah Smith, and I'm paraphrasing here, but her definition is essentially that ableism is the idea that disability is inherently inferior and is something that needs to be fixed. And so, yes, I do believe that I still struggle with ableism, because just like all of our inherent biases, they're always there, right? But now I know about it and can relate to my son better because I'm aware of it. And when I look back at some of those hard moments, it's because my ableism was so glaring that I didn't even know I had it. And part of that is because, when I went to high school, there was us and them. I never saw people with disabilities in my high school, never. The only time I would see them is when they had a hall pass to go to the bathroom, or when I had a hall pass to go to the bathroom, and you would see them kind of walking single filely behind their teacher and with their aides. That was it. There was us and them. And so my ableism is part on me, but is also in part comes from a society that still abides by separate but equal. And we still see that play out today in our schools. We were at my child's IEP, 3 IEP meetings ago, and our advocate at the end of the meeting said that her daughter said to her, Mom, I know you do all this advocacy and fight for inclusion, but I only see kids with disabilities when I have a hall pass. I was in high school 20 years ago. This is still the norm. So students with intellectual disabilities are only included in the gen ed classroom in high school with the most severe intellectual disabilities 18% of the time. This is, if we want to become a less ableist society, if we want more rights for our disabled children, we have to change this, because if we don't know people with disabilities, then this pattern of ableism is going to continue.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in the preschool, early and elementary years, it's a lot easier to include kids with disabilities in inclusion, because there's also it's not only would be disruptive, like in Lucas's case, to be pushed into something, it would also be in many situations like a waste of his time if he doesn't understand what's happening. He doesn't understand the concept. Me as a behavior analyst would rather have him, doing more work that is at his level. But, inclusion is, like you said, it can't just be when a hall pass. I mean, there has to be exposure. I think in Lucas's case, he is out in the community. He, went to typical preschool. He went to the pool. He went to church. He went, and so like, it feels like everybody in our town and at the school that he went to, he's 26 now, knew him, knew a fair amount about him. And we're always kind to him. But there again, the autism spectrum is so wide that there's kids without aids in it's just so complicated.
It is complicated. But I do think that we can do better, and it can't just be hall passes, and it can't just be at the assembly. We need more integration. That doesn't mean 100% of the day for every student, but we need that to be our default setting, right? That we start with inclusion and then see what supports and other things that are in place.
Yeah, definitely. And the whole idea of, wanting to fix things, like, I get that. And I mean, I'm with you, like, my whole life. Yeah, I didn't have much exposure, although I did have a cousin with Down syndrome when I was 8 or 10 years old. He was born, and really changed for the better our family. And he always wrote birthday cards to everybody, and it's just a real joy. So I can definitely see, I was exposed to Down syndrome through my cousin. But like, in terms of fixing things, it's like as you're talking about your son with problem behaviors, I'm like, wow, you could read my book, which is a lot about problem behaviors. You could, take the Turn Tantrums Around mini course, and we can link these in the show notes. But, where do you get, like, you're taking Anderson when he's a baby to therapy, and you're not
Yeah,
trying
no,
to,
there's a balance.
you're not
Yeah,
trying to fix it. You're just trying to
aid him to live the fullest life possible. That's what I would say. I don't wish Down syndrome away, but I do try to help those things that come with Down syndrome, like low muscle tone.
Yeah.
So he does have therapy so that he can write, and he used to have therapy so that he could start walking.
Yeah.
And we still have speech therapy. Speech therapy will probably be a part of our lives for a very long time. And all of these things are for any of our kids that don't have disabilities. We all have to give them the tools to help them live the fullest life possible. And that's how I look at therapy and behavior interventions and things like that.
Mm-hmm. So you have 2 typically developing kids, and then Anderson too. So what are your hopes and dreams and expectations for all of your kids?
That's a good question.
And do they differ with Anderson?
I think they do, if I'm being honest. I think when he was young and I was in that hole, like you're talking about, and you're getting out of the hole and you're doing all the things and you're checking all the boxes. And I thought that, if we just work hard enough, again, that mentality, if we just work hard enough, we'll get him to this place where he can still do all the normal things, right? And that's my normative bias that's in my head. Yeah. Now, I do think that his life will look different. His life is different.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And I think one of the biggest lessons that he has taught me is that a different life is not a less than life. He has a different life. It is not a less than life. We have a different life being his parents, and it's not a less than life. It comes with hard parts. It comes with sometimes sad parts with the way that the world might interact with him. And it also comes with a lot of joy too. So a different life is not a less than life. So I would say that I used to think that he would go to a college program of some sort, and he might, but that's not like the marker for him for success.
You have no control over that.
Yeah.
It's like, you don't have any control over anything that's going to happen in the future. And
sure.
It's like, you can hope. And actually, in my first book, the little acknowledgement said, to Lucas, who taught me to hope but not to expect, and appreciate the small steps along the way. And so, yeah, you can always have hopes and dreams, and well, maybe, but yeah, I can very much relate to your attitude. It's like, and as kids get older, now Lucas is 26, like his life is, I mean, minus any miracles that happen, it's going to be pretty much, he's going to live his life at this level, where he lives, and, all that kind of stuff. Not that he can't grow and change and still make progress, but, so what are your tips for, like, parents who have just gotten a diagnosis of whether it's Down syndrome in utero or whether it's autism at 3?
Hmm. Well, I would say first, I think that grief that you feel is normal. And I would sit with that grief and I wouldn't try to skip over it. Um, and eventually, when you get a little bit higher out of that hole, then you can start examining the grief, and that's when you'll learn things about your belief system that maybe you didn't even realize you had. You'll learn things that you need to unlearn, and you'll learn things that you need to learn anew. And so my advice is to go all the way through it. I talk about this in the book. It's we have an overcoming narrative in our society, right? We expect people, when something big and unexpected happens, we expect them to return to their normal selves as quickly as possible. And then we say that they overcame that. What I'm suggesting in this book, and what I'm suggesting to your parents now, is that to not do that, because it's easy to do that nowadays. You can numb out with Netflix and wine delivered to your doorstep, and you can push through and put on a happy face, and people will never know the wise. But what I'm suggesting in this book is to do the deep work of sitting with your grief and working through it and figuring out the things that are contributing to your grief. What are the things that maybe need to go? And what are the things that need to stay? And what are the new things that you need to acquire? And the book is not a how-to on how to undergo, but it's the lessons that I have learned as a parent of a child with a disability while spending many years undergoing. And that would be my number one piece of advice, is to go all the way through it.
Yeah, that's great. Have you benefited from support groups or networking with other parents?
My husband was active duty military for 9 years. And we moved in those 9 years 5 times. So our lives were just a little bit different. Thankfully, I did have a support group called the Down Syndrome Diagnosis Network. If there is anyone who has a dual diagnosis listening to this, and they were wonderful. But yeah, some online spaces and people you meet along the way. There's no other greater connection, I feel like, that I have than with another parent who has a child with a similar disability to mine. And I talk about in the book how there's a place where we meet, and that place is at the intersection of unexpected and transformed. Nobody can quite understand this life that we get to live alongside our children and all that comes with it, that and thing we talked about earlier, than other parents. So I do believe that connecting with other parents is essential.
Yeah, I do too. That's great. So before I let you go, 2 things. How can people follow you? The name of the book, where they can get it. Just let's talk about that. And then I have one final question. So
Okay.
How can people find you and your book?
So first, my website's JillianBenfield.com. I'm on Facebook at Jillian Benfield and Instagram at Jillian Benfield blog. I have several free resources on my website for parents of kids with disabilities. One is Parent Advocacy 101. I'm a Partners in Policy graduate. Highly believe in inclusive advocacy. I had Big Time Advocates review this little free resource for you, and I would love for you to grab it. And another one is called 5 Spiritual Comforts for Parents of Kids with Disabilities. And that's, of course, where you can also grab my book, which is called The Gift of the Unexpected, Discovering Who You Were Meant to Be When Life Goes Off Plan. And that is also on Amazon, Target, and at my publisher, which is Baker Publishers, which will always be 30% off if you get it there. And I can't remember what else you asked me.
Okay. Well, a couple things in the show notes that I think we should add, because just you talking along the way, but also just your summary. We have a show with a military wife who has like military, if there's other people listening in the military, that might be helpful. We have a show on IEPs with master IEP coaches, Amanda and Kirby, we can link. And we also, I know from reading the first 2 chapters of your book, you're very religious, and there's definitely a religious tone to the book. And we interviewed Elizabeth, who is a pastor, and she has a son with autism, and we did a hot seat with her, I believe. So we can link those in the show notes. They might add to the discussion. I think your discussion about grief and expectations and hope is just spot on, not only for people living with kids with Down syndrome, but also for the whole autism spectrum and any kind of disability. I think it's such an important conversation, even about ableism and about just being honest about the grief that can happen and the transformation. I love what you said about the intersection of what unexpected and transformed.
Yeah.
Transformed. Love that. So thank you so much. Before I let you go, I always like to end the same way. Part of my podcast goals is not just to help the kids, but also help the parents and professionals listening. So what kind of self-care or stress management tools do you personally use that help you be happier and less stressed?
I would say, I don't know if your listeners are going to like this. Setting an early alarm. I set a 5:30 alarm, and I pray, have my coffee without children. I guess it's a 5:15 alarm, and I work out for 30 to 45 minutes. And nothing has been better for me than that first hour and a half of my day. And if that helps somebody, great. I know that's not for everyone. I do have like a traditional New Year's resolution this year, which is to add at least 1 round of yoga a week, like not just do hard exercise, but like clearing your mind exercise. So we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, awesome. Well, best of luck with the book. I'll be, promoting it and spreading the word too, because I think it's excellent, and I really enjoyed getting to know you better. Thank you, Jillian, for being with us.
I so appreciate you. Thank you.